Check 1 2. Check 1 2. Check 1 2.
Hello, everyone. Hello. I like hello back. If everyone could just take their seats, it's time for us to begin. And good morning. My name is Cynthia Good. And can you all hear me? Good, great. I'm delighted to be here in my dual capacity of head of the Vine Awards Committee for the Koffler Center for the Arts and as a literary programmer for Holy Blossom Temple. Welcome to all of you joining us online from near and far, and welcome to everyone here in the Mishkan. It still feels like a great treat to be in person and to see people around us. And how wonderful to see so many of my good books folks here today. And I know you're joining online, many of you from very far away. For those of you book lovers who don't know about good books, let me just tell you about it for a moment. It's every second week on Zoom, every second Tuesday at 10:30 in the morning. It's only 45 minutes long. I start by talking about what I've been reading in the past couple of weeks, and then we open it up to the community and everyone shares their reading as well. It's free. You can find the link on the Holy Blossom Temple website, or you can talk to me after this event, and I'll tell you how to do it. So this event, oh, and by the way, Good Books is open to absolutely everybody. From home and away, you can access it because it's on Zoom. And to all peoples from any community and any religion, the love of books is what brings us together. This event is another partnership between the Koffler and the Temple, and I look forward to many more. Thanks to Koffler and Gillian Cade for all of her assistance. And a big thank you to the outgoing interim director, Anthony Sargent, for his great and energetic support. To the incoming general director, Matthew Jocelyn, we look forward to all that you will do. And Helen Burston, the chair of the Koffler board, will be here to close our program. I hope you've been looking at the slides, and you may have noticed a slide for the synagogue at Babin Yar. Let me tell you about this exhibit at the Koffler Gallery. The synagogue at Babin Yar exhibit links 3 moments in this time of exceptional global resonance: the original 1941 massacre, the creation and dedication of this extraordinary jewel-like wooden synagogue, and the current Russian war against Ukraine. It features large-scale photographic murals directed by Ukrainian-Canadian photographer Edward Bertinsky and taken by Ukrainian photographer Maxim Dondyuk. It is running until November 12th, and I do urge you all to see it. But some of you might want to join Holy Blossom and the Dorot program when they go to the gallery for a guided tour on November 8th. See the Holy Blossom website for registration. And now about the Vine Awards. These awards are an annual national literary award honoring both the best Canadian Jewish writers and Canadian authors who deal with Jewish subjects in the categories of fiction, history, nonfiction, poetry, and young adult and children's literature. Today, we are featuring just some of the shortlisted writers, and congratulations to all of the writers on the shortlist. You will see their names and their books on the slides. The winners will be announced on October 12th. Our gratitude to the Vine Awards sponsors, the Lillian and Norman Glowinski Family Foundation. Thanks to Jennifer Murray, Vine Awards producer, for her impeccable organization, to Tina Koffler-Boyman for her support and knowledge, and to Ben McNally for his wise advice and for being here today to sell the books from the speakers. I really encourage you to support the writers and independent bookselling by buying and reading these extraordinary books, and of course the writers will be happy to sign them for you. And a big thank you to the jury for reading the over 110 books submitted in the 5 categories covering 2 years of submissions 2021, and 2022. The jury consisted of Sidura Ludwig, who is with us today, Alain Goldschlager, and Sid Zolf. After our first panel, we will break for a light lunch, and with our second panel beginning at about 12:45, and we're going to wrap up at 1:30. Our first panel is Going Deeper, Journey and Identity in Jewish Storytelling, and I'll introduce our first moderator, Sidura Ludwig, to you now. Sidura is the author of the novel Holding My Breath and the story collection You Are Not What We Expected. That book won the Vine Award for Fiction in 2021. She will debut 2 books in 2024, a picture book, Rising, in the spring, and a middle grade novel, Swan, in the fall. She holds an MFA in writing for children and young adults from Vermont College of Fine Arts. Originally from Winnipeg, she now lives in Thornhill with her husband and 3 children. A big welcome to Sidura.
Good morning. Is this on? Can everybody hear me? No?
It's coming. Try it again, please.
Try it again?
Yeah.
Is it good? Okay. All right. Good morning. Thank you very much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here and to kick off this event with our first panel, Going Deeper, Journey and Identity in Jewish Storytelling. It's my thrill to have with me Carrie Fagan and Gary Barwin on the panel with me today. Good morning. Good morning to you both. I'm just going to jump in. I've got a little bit of introductory stuff, and then we'll start with some questions. Okay. In his book Studies in Spirituality, Rabbi Jonathan Sachs said, "To be a Jew is to travel. Judaism is a journey, not a destination." In both these shortlisted books, we have main characters embarking on major, even impossible journeys. Gary, in your book, Nothing the Same, Everything Haunted, Motel sets off across Nazi-occupied Europe to retrieve, and to paraphrase your jacket copy, a most crucial part of his reproductive anatomy, so that he might not only survive the Nazis, but defeat them by procreating. Carrie, in your middle grade novel, Water, Water, main character Rafe wakes up one morning alone in his bedroom and to find his bedroom and no other part of his house floating in a vast sea of water. He has to figure out how to survive, what happened to his family, and who he will be now in this new reality. And I'd like to start our discussion by asking both of you, what was the origin or inspiration for your book, and why choose to tell a journey story? We'll start with Carrie.
Okay. Do I have to do something with this? Is it working? Yes. Oh, sorry. I can't tell. Well, it's a little different than my previous kids' books because, well, Water, Water really was born out of fear, and it was born really out of the fear that I have for the future, that I have for particularly for our kids and what's happening to our planet. And it occurred to me that kids know everything now, and they must be full of fear too. And so I thought maybe that I could I can't write a book that's gonna have any effect to solve the problem, but maybe I could write something that could at least be a bit of a catharsis if you read it. You know, it could make you feel, kind of allow you to express inwardly some of your emotions. I think I needed it, and I thought maybe the young readers would need it. So that was part of it, my fear of climate change and the future for our kids. And the second thing was just to tell a good story, which is always something I want to do. I love survival stories. Robinson Crusoe is one of my favorite books still. And so this story, which is, about a boy, Rafe, who has to figure out why he's floating in the middle of the ocean in his room. And as you said, where's food going to come from? Are there other people alive? What's going to happen? I just, I loved immersing myself in that story itself, and I hope that by both combining my fear with my love of narrative would produce something that would be both pleasurable and, as I say, maybe relieve some temporarily relieve some stress that the reader might be feeling.
In your acknowledgements, at the end of your acknowledgements, you thank the number of school children who listened to maybe the first chapter. It sounded like maybe you had read out the first chapter and you said and wanted to hear more. And I wondered if you could elaborate a little bit on that.
Oh, well, I'm lucky because I get invited to schools and libraries to read to kids, and which I love to do. And I love reading manuscripts that are unfinished or unpublished to see what their reaction is. And I read the first chapter of this to a lot of kids, and their eyes really widen. Because at the beginning, Rafe wakes up and discovers that his parents are not there. And he opens the door, and there's water lapping up to the edge of his room. And, of course, they want to know what happens next. And so I just found that really encouraging to continue working on the book.
Gary, what about you?
I think for me, there's maybe two origins. One is, so my family my grandparents were from Lithuania, and they emigrated in the 20s and early 30s to South Africa. Then my parents moved from South Africa to Northern Ireland when they got married. They didn't want to be in South Africa. And so I grew up in Northern Ireland, and then the Troubles began, and we moved to Canada. So I've been thinking about identity and travel and what you bring with you and how you maintain that. And also, I had a cousin. We met. He had been. When my grandfather left Lithuania, he'd been looking for this cousin, and the cousin, as a small boy. When the Nazis came in 1941, his father basically told him, "You walk that way towards Russia." So he was about 8 or 9, and he walked. And then there was a retreating Russian troop transport, and said, "Okay, we have room for one boy." And they took the little boy up, and he went to safety. So I've always thinking about he literally walked himself out of the Holocaust, and so was saved. And so my grandfather found him again 30 years later in Chicago. So I was thinking about that story and thinking about the Holocaust in Lithuania, and the particular story, which it's very different than what happened in Poland and happened in other places. So that was one of the things that I was thinking about, just escape, but also I think so much of Jewish history has been about diaspora and about whether it's to Babylon or from Egypt to or all of that is there's just about a sense of moving from one place to the other and thinking back to other places, or thinking before. There's a horse in the book, and the horse is named, the horse never goes where it's told to go. It always seems to head towards Israel, so they call it Theodor Herzl, because they try to make it go this way and it wants to go that way, so that's why they call it that. And sort of thinking of, just thinking of that kind of pull or that kind of connection or thought about identifying yourself from place and being displaced, and what that means. The other thing is, the book is also based on cowboy stories. I became really fascinated by the writing of Karl May. He was a German Western writer, the most popular German writer of the 20th century, and he wrote these Westerns that were sort of using the trope of the noble savage, the indigenous person. So that was really interesting, and they were so popular, and I was thinking about that. But also what really blew my mind was they were Hitler's favorite book. And so the idea that Hitler was fascinated by indigenous, this idealized form of indigenous people, and this notion of the West. And then reading more about it, about how Hitler had borrowed ideas from colonialism. So going west, Manifest Destiny in the Americas, clearing out the space so that settlers could move and indigenous people could move out. Well, that's the same thing exactly that Hitler borrowed for going east, Liebestrom, clearing out space for Germans to move into Eastern Europe. So just the confluence of those things, and so the fact that Hitler was so obsessed by and borrowed all these Western tropes. So then I was thinking, I wanted to model my book after a Western, and Westerns very often have a quest in it. They're searching for something. They go out into the wild lands looking for something, or to find, in a way, they go on a quest, and they in a traditional quest, they find something about themselves. They need to reconcile something. So that was really that was another reason why I was interested in the quest. And also, I would say that part of Jewish identity has always been about connecting. Every text refers to another text. And so this kind of intertextuality about having, my book is sort of riffing off the idea of a Western. And I just want to say one more thing, which is that I also, as a Jew, wanted to I wanted to address indigenous issues as a Canadian writer, and how to do that. And so from my kind of positionality as a Jew, thinking about the connections between the Holocaust and specifically Hitler's idea about the West, but also just, is there something I could bring to this conversation, or I could understand it through my Jewish identity? So that was one of the other reasons that I wanted to also pursue kind of cowboys and traveling and all of that.
Thank you. And that's what you said about the quest and the quest also being something that's there's an inner quest usually with the external quest. It dovetails nicely into my next question, which is that in each of these books there's an arduous physical journey. So we have Rafe, who finds himself in the sea of water. We have Motel, who comes across all different kinds of challenges along the way. But there's also an individual emotional journey, perhaps even a quieter individual emotional journey that each character faces. And I wonder if you can talk about how the one framework feeds the other in your story. I'll go back to you, Carrie.
Right. Fascinating questions. I would say, right, there in my book, there's this actual physical journey of floating in the ocean, of trying to discover what's out there and if there is any future possible. And I think for the character, Rafe, there's a question of how do you remain human under such conditions, right? And especially when first he's alone, which he, I think, partly does through reading. He's got one book with him called Conversations with a Rabbit that he starts to read. And then he does spot other humans that were floating, and he does end up taking in a much younger girl who is from Thailand and speaks a little bit of English because she watched a lot of the TV show Friends, as it turns out. And he's at first rather unhappy that he has to bring her in and share everything with her, but they end up becoming very much like siblings and forging a kind of new family and learning to take care of each other. So, he really, I don't think it's explicit, and I don't think I was explicitly thinking about that, but I do think he has to think about, how not just to survive, but how to survive in some kind of meaningful way. And and that really happens through the person he meets, and eventually through a larger community that does survive. So it's really through people, and the physical journey, I think, has to bring him back to the human world somehow. That's, I guess, what happens.
So the physical journey is really the challenges that he's facing along the way. But then he's got his dog. He does discover his dog is with him.
He has his dog, thank goodness, yes.
So so he is looking after his dog all this time. But every challenge that he faces on the physical journey is a reminder of what it means for him to be human, not only to survive but also to look after. So first to look after Buddy, the dog, and then to look after the girl that he brings on. Right,
and because they're bad people too. There's these teenagers who turn out to be pirates. I think all teenagers are probably pirates. So, and to try to board his room and take all his stuff, and it's another way of thinking about how, is it survival at any cost? But what, or is it something more than that? So, yeah.
Okay. And Gary, what about you? Talk about the physical and emotional journey in yours.
Yeah, so people sometimes undergo a journey to find a part of themselves. Model is trying to find a part of themselves. His testicles were shot off 20 years before. They fell into a glacier where they froze. So now he's crossing Europe in the middle of the World War II to find his testicles, and then hopefully that's where he's going to procreate and create new life and kind of find a part of himself. And in his case, he's sort of thinking about being a man. He's imagining also being a kind of like a cowboy. So he wants to be this sort of Clint Eastwood, tough, laconic sort of macho kind of guy, and he's not. He's really he's a middle-aged, sort of a bit of a nabbish. And so the thing is, what he finds is that he actually has a strength not in being the tough, macho, leather-faced cowboy, but actually being a different kind of a man, different kind of a supporter, having he meets a woman, and in the way he supports her, and the way he has another kind of bravery through through ingenuity, but also through kindness and through support. He comes to, there's a journey where he learns something about himself that in fact who he really is, which is actually strong in a different way than this sort of storybook idea of the macho guy. So I think that's one of the, aside from all of the stuff that he goes through, just escaping from Vilnius, he also finds that emotional journey for himself. And in the end, he actually ends up in Toronto, actually. And so all of that journey and inventing a life, and then how do you live after the Holocaust? And that's part of the other second part of the book, is that journey of how he finds himself and how he reconciles all of the things and all the losses and all of the gains that he's had in his life, physically as well as emotionally.
And there are notes of intergenerational trauma in that section of the book. We meet his granddaughter.
Well, but both his granddaughter and his daughter, because I think the journey doesn't just end with him. The journey, in such a traumatic journey, the journey continues with the children and the grandchildren. I mean, with any trauma, and maybe with any journey, but certainly in the case of the Holocaust and the trauma, they inherit part of that journey, and then they have their own journey that they have to go through in order to, their own growth, their own reconciliation with history.
Right, history and the stories that we inherit.
No, absolutely, right. Yeah, which I guess that what's history and what story it overlaps, and part of that is for them to sort it out, and how does that relate to them, and how does that relate to the contemporary world as well, and then what does that mean for them? Which I think we all inherit stories and language and identity and all of those complexities, and we have to think of them reinterpret them for ourselves to understand who we are and how to proceed in our world, in our life.
All right. Trauma infuses both of these books, sometimes in more overt ways, sometimes in more subtle ways. But in both cases, we've got books that are dealing with really horrific settings. We've got, World War II Europe and Holocaust, and we've got, the implication that the flood is related to climate change. Though it's never really, it's never said outright, which I think was a really interesting choice. And maybe you can speak to that as well. But I'm going to ask my question first, which is. What I found when I was reading both of them was that the adventure component of each of these stories, it helps to shift the reader's emotional focus away from the trauma, away from the horror, and instead centers us on the character's agency. In both cases, we've got main characters who have a lot of autonomy and a lot of agency. Can you speak, both of you, to the effect writing a journey story helped you to navigate difficult subject matter? And I think this time, Gary, I'll start with you.
Thanks. These are really insightful questions. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I do think it's a lot about agency, and I guess I think the whole story is about my character finding agency, and what does that look like. So, in fact, there's lots of humor in the book, and part of that is by my character taking agency, by being able to think of things humorously, to be able to be the center of his own story and be telling the story. That's taking agency. So whatever is happening, it's his story, even if it's traumatic. Somehow it's his story for him to claim and him to kind of work through. So I think that's a really key point that you make. And so one of the things is, how do you tell a really difficult story and so there is an element of adventure, and there is an element, despite the horrors of these remarkable stories and remarkable adventures of escape, of ingenuity, of love, of loss. That's, built into war, built into the Holocaust, and people have these. And I've heard really many remarkable stories from survivors of all of stories. Some that seem almost like fables, whether they're really dark or not dark, or whether they're tragic or not tragic. I should say they're all dark, I guess, even within the humor. So that, to me, is that helps like there's a propulsion of this. I need to get out of here. I need to move through my life. I need to somehow survive. But that's also a kind of it's a narrative, right? Like I'm here, and I don't want to be here. I want it to be different. How can I? And so there's that kind of propulsion, I think, and excuse me, and just telling telling a story. There's some sense of that agency of telling a story. It's like, sit down and I'm going to tell you a story of what happened to me. And there's that intensity, that kind of human, agency, human power of just that ability to move through time, move through history, move through your life is so powerful. One story from the book, which I stole from Avram Sutzkever, the Yiddish poet who was also a partisan fighting in Lithuania against the Nazis. He tells a story. I heard this interview with him when he was an old man in Israel. He survived the war. He wrote many poems during the war. But he said he was being chased by the Nazis, and he got to the edge of a field, and it was a minefield, and he knew there were mines there, and but he couldn't. He had to go because the Nazis were chasing him, so he didn't know how he was going to get through it. So what he said is, well, I don't know where they are, so I'm going to walk in the pace of a poem, because it makes as much sense as, like, I'll walk in that rhythm, and that makes as much sense as anything, because how else am I going to make it through? And so he walked through, and he survived. He didn't walk on a mine. And so in the interview with him as an old man, he goes, and so I wish I remembered what that poem was, because it could come in useful. And there's something in that story that is so, it's funny, but it's also this kind of it's this deeply ironic, dark story, but also the kind of bravado of he lived, and it brings you right into that, and it encapsulates the surreal, crazy trauma of what he lived through, but also was victorious. So there's something that those help, I think. I think that the joke he makes comes from deep trauma.
Yeah, and I think also there's something to, when we're writing historical fiction, we already know the ending. And so there is a sort of relief that can come even in as horrific and as traumatic as the story is. We know in a sense what the general ending, the Jewish people, that we have survived and thrived even through the trauma.
But then what does that look like? And so that's an interesting thing. The other thing I mentioned in the book, there's a guy, I adapted, but I like to tell this, another story I like to tell is there's a video of a guy, a survivor, standing in front of the gates of Auschwitz with his granddaughter, with his daughter and his grandchildren, and they're dancing at the gates to Gloria Gaynor's "I Will Survive." And it's like this amazing thing, and it's like, the story of him, he survived, but how am I going to show that? And so it's in that, that's his own personal survival expression in his own, ironic way. And so I think we know the story, but how do we tell that? And how do we remember, and what's our responsibility to not only to witness, but also, as Solange says, to witness the witnesses, the people who have remembered. So for me, that's also where, unlike your story, where it's unfolding with climate crisis, this is what do I do, third generation on, what can I bring to the story? I kind of feel I'm witnessing the witnesses,
I'm so glad that we have both of you on this panel because in this way, we've got one that's historical fiction and one that feels scarily present day.
Right. I think this is, I think one of the ironies of the novel is that, and this really applies to Gary's book and mine both, is that no matter how serious the subject matter, I think novels are supposed to provide pleasure in some way, and pleasure is a very complicated thing. And sometimes it's just the level of language itself, but I do think I do think it's different from a nonfiction work or historical, documentary kind of work. I think novels have a somewhat different function, and so part of it is that. And for me particularly, it's about writing for kids. I get asked a lot, because I write novels for adults, I get asked a lot, what's the difference? And I used to always say, there's not really any difference. It's all writing. You try to write the best story, create characters. And I realized at some point that I was kind of lying a little bit, that there is a difference between writing for kids and adults. And one of them is you need to respect your audience of kids and where they are in becoming human beings, right? You would not show a horror movie to a 5-year-old. I mean, it would traumatize them. They cannot absorb and make sense of it. And in the same way, you have to be respectful of how developed your audience is. So it's not censorship, it's something else. So I'm very keenly aware that, when I write, I always think I have one eye looking in and one eye looking out at my imagined audience at the same time. I need to, and writing for kids is no different. I need to be satisfying my own needs as a writer, but I also am very keenly conscious of the needs of the reader. And I'm trying to create a good story. I'm trying to deal with because Rafe actually realizes that his parents are gone and everybody he knows is gone. But how do you deal with that in a way that a kid can cope with? And part of the answer for the book is that Rafe kind of has to put those emotions off just to survive. And then at the end, you can see that he's going to have a chance to really process it eventually. And I think so. And part of it is enveloping it in this more of an adventure story. So I'm hoping to get emotional react from the readers, and of course you never know what that will be. It's not. I'm not trying to completely guide the reaction of the reader. Everybody has their own reaction, but I'm trying to also allow something of an escape valve, I guess, and that I think comes from just really caring about how I might be affecting the kids who will read the book.
I was really taken when I read your book these questions would come to Rafe, where, what happened to my parents, what's going on in the world, but he would very quickly push them out of his head he was a defense mechanism. It was almost as if he understood he couldn't deal with that right now. And then, not to give anything away, but at the end when he finds this community of survivors and he meets this woman who invites him to come and join the community, and he sees the future for himself, it's only then when he allows himself to recognize that he misses his parents. And it's really only at that point that as a reader we see him realizing that this isn't a fantasy. This is something that's really happened to him. Right, and part of that I think is what you really need to do to survive. You can't deal with the trauma immediately when you're just, trying to keep your head above water, literally in his case. And part of it is a little bit strategic and putting it off for the reader's sake. And that's the sort of thing when you're writing for a long, it's kind of, I didn't consciously always think of that I was doing that. It's just, your instinct as a writer kicks in and those things come to you. But I think there are times when he is thinking about it and I immediately have something happen that prevents him from thinking it more. And those times I was aware that I was actually cutting off at that moment some of those thoughts so that they could be allowed to just, be there somewhere for later. Yeah. But I think that was also important, again, keeping the audience in mind and how you use then the journey or the quest to take your young audience through a difficult subject matter. So it's not ignoring the questions, but it's using the adventure to work their way through. Go ahead, Gary.
I was just going to say, it was really interesting because I've been thinking about. I was talking about my cousin Isaac, and so when he walked away from Vilnius, but when he came back, it was after the war. He ended up in the Ural Mountains, and he came back. And I was asking him. I was interviewed him for the book, and I wanted. So when he came back, he was about 14, and I asked him. He came back, and everybody he knew was dead. Had all his family, kind of like you wake up and he's surrounded. And so. And he said, well, it was great. I had no one to tell me what to do. I went, and so we climbed on a train, and we went to Moscow. We went to the big city. And I was like, I kept asking, no, but surely you must have felt like trauma. And I think exactly what you're saying is that, first of all, he's at a different stage. He was a kid, and he didn't have the maturity to even begin to process this horror. But also, I think he put it off, because how could he possibly imagine his world had gone? So instead, he went just followed, and it's another kind of a thing. It's kind of adventure, and I think he spent the rest of his life thinking about it, but not at that moment.
Right. That really reminds me of my dad, because my dad grew up in Brussels and the Nazis invaded when he was 14 and his family fled, and they were basically fleeing for about 2 years, down south of France and Portugal, and that he ended up in a refugee camp in Jamaica. And it was something of an adventure for my father. But I think it was also my dad's upbeat personality. I think it's partly who you are. I think other people would treat differently. My mom was born in Toronto. She was born onto Nassau Street in Kensington Market. And she's a much more pessimistic person than my dad was. And it's God bless them both. It's just they're just really very different people. And I think some of it comes from innate nature.
Yeah.
I have other questions, but I'm checking the time. And we have about 5 minutes left, and I'd like to open up if there are any questions from the audience. If anyone... Yes, go ahead.
Very simple question. Why the flood?
Why the flood?
Yes.
I don't really exactly know the answer to that. It just... I liked the idea of him being very confined, and I think it's because I'm afraid of large bodies of water. I think I think I almost drowned when we went on a holiday once in Nassau. My mom grabbed me and picked me out of the water when the tide was coming in, and I've since then, although I love the ocean and I love lakes, I still have a slight fear, and I think it partly comes from that. I wasn't in any deliberate way thinking of the Noah story, which is hard to avoid. How can you avoid the story of Noah's Ark when you think about a flood? But I do, only as I was thinking about it recently, realized that there's something that happens at the very end where this little insect, this moth, appeared, and I realized I'm really conjuring up the dove at the end of Noah's Ark and the Noah story, and I didn't realize it when I was writing it, but I see it now. So I guess there was something there that was definitely, reverberating.
Go ahead.
What we call middle grade, which until I wrote a middle grade novel, I didn't know there was such a thing. But it's not teenagers. It's like 9 to 12 maybe. I don't write for teenagers. I leave that to my betters. We don't have to deal with sex in middle grade novels too much. So.
No, it's not.
It's struck a bell.
Oh.
We have another question over here.
Sorry, he was here talking about it in March. Yeah.
Thank you both. I absolutely adore the commentary that you've made about your novels and the questions. So, at the end of each of your novels, do you think the reader is left with a feeling of optimism or pessimism?
And that is a great question, I think, for us to end on. So.
Well,
Okay, I'm actually going to start with Gary.
Start with Gary.
Yeah.
Please
so you
do.
can start with because it's darker and more. Well, I think we were just actually talking about the difference between books for kids and books for adults, and so for me, it's more complicated than just. I think I want to end with the complexity of a situation. I think it's optimistic in that the richness of human life and our ability to, and all of the complicated ways that we deal with adversity and with good things too. Just sort of it's about expanding how you can possibly imagine. That's what I would aspire to, rather than simply like I think it's going to be okay because ultimately we're humans and humans are okay. Like, I guess in that sense, but not more specifically, like in terms of and it's all everything resolved. It's about the Holocaust. It's about Indigenous genocide. But just to say that it's to celebrate storytelling and to celebrate the complexity of humanity and our way of a way of imagining being in the world, I think.
I guess there's the world and there's the story, and in my story, it does definitely have a hopeful ending. And it was a challenge, okay, the entire world has flooded and millions are dead, and how do you create a hopeful ending? But I think I did find a way that is satisfying within the context of the story, and I think that's part of what I wanted to give kids. Now, does that mean they don't have anything to worry about and they should just be hopeful? Well, I think the story works, stories work a little differently from the world, and I don't know if we can be as optimistic in reality. And I think that that's something I hope kids will have lots to think about and maybe talk about around it. And part of it is the role that art plays, for our own need and pleasure and well-being and what we do about the world. So.
Thank you both. This has been a fantastic conversation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, all three of you, Sadura and Gary and Carrie. Interesting to hear something I really believe in, the pleasure and power of fiction in dealing with trauma is one of the subjects that you approached. Thank you so much. So lunch is being laid out for us right now. And once it's there, please go up and get your lunch, and then we will begin again at 12:45, and you can talk at your table about the subjects that have been raised. Thank you. You to enjoy eating as we go on. Again, thanks to our first panel. And before we start our second, I would like to give some quick thank yous to my colleagues here at Holy Blossom. Thanks to our facilities and tech team, to Pavel and Dante, always for all their good assistance. Yay! Where would we be without them, right? And to our fantastic caterers, Holy Grounds. We are so grateful for the good food, and all of you who come here to Holy Blossom, I encourage you to go to our Holy Grounds Cafe and enjoy the food and coffee there. And to Sharoni Siboney and Naomi Offman, always for their assistance in all of our literary programming. Thank you so much. And to the Adult Education Committee, Les Rothschild and Jillian Helfield. And as always, the greatest thanks goes to our senior rabbi, Yael Splansky. Our second panel, which I'm sure we are all looking forward to, is Divine Intervention, Stories, Characters, and Writers, with our moderator, Eric Beck-Rubin. Eric is a fiction writer and academic who writes, researches, and teaches on monuments and memorials at U of T and the University of Waterloo School of Architecture. His first novel was called School of Velocity, and I encourage you to read it. It's also up here for sale. Welcome, Eric.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, everyone can hear me? All right. Shilhedi and Adam Saul, I feel extremely honored to be here, so thank you very, very much. And thank you for the invitation. So I had a first question, but I'm going to lay that question aside for the moment. Maybe we'll never get back to it, I don't know, because Adam, you had this beautiful description of what a poem is involving a bubble, and I'm going to leave it to you to fill in what that was, and we'll go from there.
I'm stealing from myself, actually, but the idea is that we create, it's like you're creating a bubble out of language, and you sort of set it spinning and hope that it'll float on its own. Which means that you never know if it's tethered to the ground or not. It's not supposed to be tethered to the ground, that you just hope it floats.
And you were saying that in reference to Pure Color, which I think more than your previous two novels really exemplifies that description. I wondered if you agree, and what do you think about it?
That it's a bubble that floats. I mean, Adam was talking about that description earlier in reference to poetry, that like a poem is like a bubble that floats, and it's not really, it's got to sort of have its own, it's not tethered to something else. It's complete in itself and sort of weightless. And yeah, I mean, I think because the book talk is more spiritual than my other books, and it deals with death and it deals with nature. And when I was writing it, I was thinking a little bit about like, how can I write a novel that works the way a painting works? Maybe in that sense, it's more like a bubble that floats, because, you know, the thing, my best friend is a painter, and I always love or sort of envy that with a painting, you can just take it all in one glance, you know? And with a novel, you have to take one page in at a time. And so I was trying to think of like, how could you write a novel so that you can, once it's done, you can see it in sort of one glance in your memory or in your imagination, the same way you see a painting in one glance. So yeah, in that sense, the bubble metaphor makes sense.
Well, and that you never know if it's floating or not. I mean, that's the difference between a real bubble and like, you know, I mean, the book is there, so it seems to float. People seem to like it. I liked it. So like that. So it seems to float, okay, but you're never actually really sure if it's floating or if it's just a contraption.
Yeah, and then it can float for some people and not float for others.
Right.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, I was thinking about that. what you were just saying with regards to the painting. That's something I admire very much in your work, which is to take an idea that is so complex, layered, has so much history behind it, but to present it in almost naive form. You know, I was trying to create a novel like a painting. But a painting, is that something you work on as you're drafting this book, or is this something you keep in mind? Like, how do you even grapple with something so strange, a comparison that strikes me at least as so strange?
To me, I don't know if you feel the same way, but to me, making art is like just being a kid and having this amazing puzzle. And it's hard, but it's also fun. And I always want to do something impossible, or I always have some impossible like goal in mind. So with the book that I'm writing now, I keep thinking I want to write a book that eats its own tail. And I don't even really know what that means, but it kind of excites me when I think about that phrase, like a book that eats its own tail. And I think having something like that that's not really literal. It's almost like you have a dream about the book before you write the book itself. Like you're sort of pursuing something that you can't ever achieve, but it like leads you forward.
And we've both published a bunch of books, so like you try to trust yourself that the absurd thing that you're trying to do will somehow work, that it'll float, right? Like this morning I was like, can I put the word pshaw in a poem? Like right. It's maybe the stupidest word in the language, and it's just like can I manage that? Like what would be the circumstances in which I could use the word pshaw in a poem? And like, okay, let's see if I can do that. And I haven't written the poem yet, but like that's those kinds of like test cases that you do, and then you do trust enough. You trust the rest of your instincts enough to kind of make something that might work.
Well, in the last question sort of on this subject, or maybe not, I don't know, but it seems to me that you always have really trusted your instincts because you take incredible risks in your writing. And this, to me, like your previous work, takes those risks, but unlike your previous work, I think takes these risks emotionally, spiritually, which is a word you used, and a word I have a lot of difficulty using, but I think it's absolutely accurate. And in terms of discarding the rational for the sense of evoking feelings and the complexity and the challenge of even describing feelings, it's like describing music. Is that, again, does this mark a change? Do you recognize that as a change from previous works? If I can put it, this less rational aspect to the book.
Yes, probably, but it also has to do with the themes that I was dealing with. Like a lot of this book was written in the wake of my father's death, so you aren't really having a rational experience of the world when you've lost a parent or somebody so close to you like a parent. You are experiencing the world in a kind of surreal way because this anchor of reality has been taken away, and you're sort of like floating in the universe. You're not, and I think to me that's what the experience of grief was. It was like being completely untethered to the social world, being untethered to sort of the structure that I had inhabited previously. And you don't really realize how much, or I didn't realize how much a parent was an ordering principle of one's life. And then the parent goes, and you don't have this barrier between you and the world. Even if you're a grown-up, there's still a sense in which maybe not everybody feels this way, but I felt this way, like kind of protected by the fact that I had my father alive. And then when he was gone, I was like, oh, I don't really know what the universe is actually. I only know what it is with him in it. So the surreal or the emotional or this new quality that you see in the work is a result of the book being about that and written in the wake of that huge loss, and sort of feeling like a new creature and just born.
I am going to try to now go back to the theme, or the purported theme, which is divine intervention. So I was thinking about these two books in common, and I just written down that notwithstanding where we are, which is a synagogue, and notwithstanding that these are Jewish Book Awards, I think that anybody who invokes the subject of God without some kind of external reason for it is possibly psychotic. I mean, in conversation. I mean, you can talk about sports and you could talk about art, of course, have to talk about art. You could talk about, your family, physical ailments, of course. But you just don't talk about God to your friends. So my question really, and I'll start with Adam, is how dare you?
Yeah. Yeah, in this house, right? I mean, on the other hand, like, how can you not? Like, I mean, these are poems. This is not casual conversation, right? And so it is a different medium. And when the big things happen, you think about the big things, and you have things to say toward the big things. And so that's naturally where I went. And also for me, it's a book. It's a morning, M-O-R-N, no U there. It's a morning book, and so I was thinking about the things that happen in the morning, and so the morning prayers speak to me. They're prayers that, even the kind of speed of them, the way we do them rapid fire at Shachrit service, like there was something about that rhythm, short, quick, like little sort of okay, then we're gonna, thanks for giving me clothes, okay, thanks for waking me up, gives rest to the weary, which don't seem to cover everything and sort of cover everything, and so I wanted to direct it in that way. And then the question is, who are you speaking to, right? And in some ways, when you're writing, there's this weird sense, you're always, if you write to publish, then you're always sort of thinking about this listener or reader who is in a weird way like God, right? So
very much in this collection, not in a weird way like God, but very obviously, if I can interrupt, which I have, sorry. Not sorry, apparently. But definitely, the listener of these poems struck me as being God. The interlocutor of this, that accompanies this person, don't know how to use that word in that sentence, but basically the conversant, still can't figure it out. The person that the narrator is speaking to speaks back either between the poems or in the actions described in the poems. So yes, God is more than just a subject or an addressee. Definitely a participant. And now that I've cut you off, I'm sorry, but I wanted also to note that these are some of the terms that you use to describe God. Buster, you, noted they're all capitalized. Boss man, the unresponsible, pale sufferer, chief flunky, absent manager, uncle. And at one point I would say on page 52, there's the possibility you can interpret yourself, the speaker, as inhabiting the role of God as well.
Yeah, well, we've got a lot of names for God. And I just added a few, I guess. I feel like God can handle it. Whichever version of God you do or don't believe in, adding more names to that force is not going to do damage to it. And for me, Jewish tradition had, it literally means to wrangle, to wrestle with God, and that includes name calling for me. And when you're mad, you can call it Buster, and when you don't know what it's doing, you can call it Chief Flunky, and that seems to be part of, my religious sensibility. Starts from that we have to come to it as we are and where we are, and if it's in anger, if it's in worry, it's in grief, then we have to use the language that's appropriate to us, and again, God will figure that out. God's a good translator, whatever that is. I don't have to worry about that's hilarious that you would offend God. Whatever. So I trusted that impulse, I guess. Let that anger, and I've got Tevye in my head too, who likes to talk to God in sort of dumb ways too. So that's that. I sort of am joining that tradition.
Yeah, we absolutely have. It's the right time to make that remark. We have Fiddler on the Roof on repeat at our house right now, and
Excellent.
my daughter has decided she'll be Tevye, and my wife will be Golda, and I think I'm going to be the horse for Halloween, something like that. Then I feel like, well, I'll just ask you as well, like Sheila, you could have used the word creator, the first artist, anything. You could have used any number of words, but you use the word God right at the beginning and throughout the book. Is that something you struggled with, or what are the opportunities of that word, or how do you see it?
I don't know. I guess like Adam, I don't feel embarrassed to use the word. It doesn't feel like something separate from daily life. It doesn't feel like a taboo word, and it feels like a word that's native to literature and native to poetry, and like it's strange that in this time we don't use it and that we consider it off limits. I think that this is the anomaly time, not us using it. Yeah.
I find that, I mean, thank you for the answer. Fascinating.
It's a great question.
But it's really a great answer.
We were very worried about, because we kept saying how good the answers were when Gary and Carrie and Sidura were talking. You know, the questions were so good.
And Sidura had declared it a great conversation.
A great conversation, and they kept saying that's a fantastic question.
And could we rise to that kind
yeah,
of self?
so that was a fantastic question.
Okay. The other. So following on from that, I mean, for me, I was thinking about how should a person be motherhood, and how should a person be Moses is a character, and in a sense a role model. And of course, there's this beautiful evocation of the story of Jacob wrestling with the angel in motherhood. And so it seemed to me that there was definitely something biblical that would underline this story. And I thought, well, yes, there's God, and yes, there's a story that is like the remaking of the world in Noah's Ark. But for me, this is more an Adam and Eve story, and that's what came through most strongly insofar as you have the story of a man and a woman. The man gives birth to the woman. I don't think there's a reference to a mother in this. And for a long time, they inhabit paradise together.
I don't know if it's paradise exactly. I mean, they go into a leaf in a tree.
But you don't think the
spirits.
conversation and the time that they're able to share there is
Paradise? I thought of it more as like a kind of limbo or something, like before the next stage, which is when, I don't know. I mean, again, do the dead ever really leave us? No, but or in my case, my father was especially present in the year and years following his death. But what is the space that you inhabit with the loved one who dies? Like, it's not here in the physical world. So them being in the leaf together is a way of saying, yes, you inhabit this space, but you can't really describe what the space is. It doesn't really make sense. It's something that you can't quite touch, even if it feels real. So I don't really think of it as paradise. I just more felt it as like here but not here. Like a leaf in a tree is here, but you being in the leaf in the tree means that it's not quite here. So it was just, I thought it was sort of in between death and life. I
guess the reason I use that word for myself, and I should say that I've deliberately not tried to summarize or synopsize your novel in any way, because I think more than most, the elements of a novel, characters, setting, plot, they all exist in pure color. But as I was saying, more than most novels, they exist inside the individual reader's head as they put those things together for themselves. And I cannot imagine that the way I read it is the way that anybody else will read it. I think that's one of its many powers. So to get back for me, when I was reading those conversations, that was so wonderful, so impossible, so beautiful, so, and it hurts me to say this, so moving that it was an element of a time and a place that couldn't exist, like paradise, that is liminal, like paradise. There's always a fall afterwards. And that's why I reach for that word, but then.
Yeah, maybe you're right. I just hadn't thought of it that way. I hadn't thought of it as an Adam
so I
and
could
Eve
be
story.
right.
I think you're right.
Okay.
I'm wrong.
Well, there you go. So thank you. I wanted to ask you, Adam. When I tried to pin you down on the years in which that your poems reflect, you sort of said 2015, 16. Is that a year that has kept going for you?
I mean, I deliberately made it a little mushy when things were happening. Poems don't have the same obligations. I mean, your novel isn't either. Like, I don't know when it takes place either. And like, so, but a lot of novels, like, they want you to know if there's a time reference, like there's a technology reference, like 50 years from now, we'll be like, oh, they didn't have super whatever things then, so it must take place during this period, right? But I was deliberately mushy about when it takes place, year-wise. I guess, I mean, all of these, the issues that are brought up in it, are ongoing. There's still police violence. I don't know if you've heard, but it hasn't stopped. We still have worries. We still worry about our family. Like, you know, there's still people who are recovering from surgery. Like, so those things still happen. It's not happening in the same way in my house, you know, and so that's something. But I guess, like, I didn't think about sort of historical time. I was thinking very much about, you know, morning versus evening. You know, like, it's a morning book, so I was thinking about about time in that sense, but not so much about historical time.
What made you think like a morning book? Like, where did that first impulse come from?
Some of it is just about practice, about when I was waking up. You know, when I was writing. There are a lot, especially in the summertime. That would be when I would wait. And in fact, it's actually a real problem now. Like, I can't write in the morning anymore. Last summer, when school ended and I was like, had a little more time, and I woke up early and I was going to sit at my desk, and I was like, oh no, this is done. This is over. And even like the light, and like, I didn't want to listen. I didn't want to write about the birds. I didn't want to, like, nothing. It was just like, and I stopped writing in the morning. It took me all summer, last summer, to realize that the afternoon is better now. You know, like, it was just like dumb things like that. That like, okay, now the afternoon. So what is the light like in the afternoon? What is the, you know, this at our back porch faces east, so the sun would rise in my face in some ways, and that. I don't know. I'm sure it impacted the way I was writing. And now, if I'm writing in the afternoon, it faces a different direction.
Is it just because of like the sickness of like the book being done, and you don't want to still be in that world of that book?
It was definitely a little bit of that, absolutely, and sort of wanting to like just do the next thing, right? I mean, what is it? Frost said that you try to write every poem as radically different from the last thing you wrote as possible, which is a way of admitting that you can't, because you still are inhabiting your own skin and your own language and your own perspective. And so I wanted to do the things that I'm working on now are next, are trying to be different, and of course they're still coming out of me, so they'll be similar, you know. But
I always feel like that with every novel or every book, that I want it to be radically different from the next. But
yeah.
I would never have thought that, I mean, to do that with a poem seems so much more, there has to be so much more change in your life. Like, that's so much turning and turning and turning and turning.
It's a different approach to the language, right? Like, I think you want to, like, it's almost a musical thing for me. Like, I want to hear a different tune than when I'm working, and like, I'm trying to actually, I'm trying to write louder right now. I want to bang a little bit, like, right now, and that's kind of fun for me. But it's still, you know, you end up looking for things and responding to things, and pshaw.
I don't think I could ever write with a different tune. Like, to me, I feel like there's just like always the same sound that I want out of the sentence.
Yeah.
Or there's, I think that's so deep inside my brain, that sound that I want, or that tune, or the way a sentence sounds right or wrong.
I admire that about your work.
I don't know if it's admire or not. It's just a kind of like a magnet that I'm drawn to.
But it's also, and it also means that like you take that kind of sparkly sort of attention and just put it on something else. Right. And so what we do as readers is follow that electric attention. I keep thinking about like the lamp, like the main character turning off the lamps in the lamp store where she's working, and seeing that the person across the way is also turning off the lamps because there's another lamp store across the street, and like how just completely, like it's in your voice, like it's in that recognizable Sheila Heti voice, and yet, and also sort of just almost like there's this like throwaway quality to it, and then you think, and that image just keeps like, what does that mean about people in grief and people trying to communicate to each other, people even like pandemic, you know, like how we were all like just turning the lamps on and off in our individual little houses, and like suddenly that kind of the way it crystallizes in just this, you know, it is, I always feel like that voice of yours is always sounds like it's just off the cuff. And that's such a remarkable power, because that's really hard to pull off, and it sort of allows us to kind of stumble into these kind of insights that are unique, I think.
Oh, thank you.
Great question.
Great answer.
I also agree that there's incredible consistency of voice. For me, that voice in the novels has different registers, though. And there is a register, again, I really do not encounter in contemporary fiction. And actually, if I can put it this way, for all the descriptions of your work as representative of this time and place, generation, I don't come across the diction, the syntax, the use of something as simple or prosaic as exclamation marks, just to express sheer enthusiasm, a certain naivete, a certain wonder in a book that is otherwise so knowing. I just don't come across those things very often, and it does strike me in a strange way, and I again, this is a question I would have asked regardless of circumstance, that there is something slightly biblical, at least in the reach of the questions that you're asking. And I can't imagine asking you, like, what have you read recently? You know, and God. But do you is that part of your literature, or is it part of your literature sort of at secondhand through the literature of others? How do you see it?
I don't know. I mean, we were talking about this earlier. I went to Hebrew school here, and I went to like preschool here, and my family, you know, is on Ava Road. That's where I grew up, and I feel like we were not. I think we came once in a while for the high holidays, but mostly not really. My father really didn't believe in God, like in a very vocal way. My mother too, in a very, very rational, rationalist kind of way. And yet, like my fondest memories of growing up were like having Passover dinner at my grandmother's house, or having Hanukkah, or having the holidays. And there was something about the repetition of it, and the fact that it was connected to the seasons, and that we would tell the same story, and then my father would like argue with the story and say it couldn't have historically been that way, and then my mother would cry and my grandmother would cry, and we'd all like get in a fight, and like everyone had a horrible time. Like I loved those memories so much. And to me it's like that's where like the meat of life is for me, in that. And I was always like dazzled by this idea that for thousands of years, Jewish families have been coming together and telling these stories. So I think from a very young age, I had the sense of like, oh, I'm not just in this present historical moment, I'm like part of this historical lineage that's doing the same thing for thousands of years. And really like, I know, and so for my books, like even when I wrote my first book, The Middle Stories, I thought like I don't want any pop cultural references because I want this. I understood that a story could be told for thousands of years. So if you put like Coca-Cola in your stories, like how are they going to understand that? And well, they probably still will. They'll probably still be Coca-Cola in 1,000 years. But it was always this ambition, I think, to like make stories that could travel through time, you know. And so I think there's always been a desire to have a book that inhabits now, but also has that sort of like, you know, you put two mirrors to face each other and these images go all the, you know. I spent a lot of time standing between two mirrors when I was a child. Just like, oh, the image goes all the way into the distance, yeah, and into the future. So
I mean, there is a line in the book, I'm going to misquote it, try to paraphrase it, but that we want the art to aspire to the condition of being plants in some way. If I got it right, something like that. Is that about right?
yeah, I like the idea that a book should be as natural as a tree, or as, you know, art is part of nature. Like art is human nature, and human nature is nature. So do you feel like that? Well, I guess that's the bubble idea as well. Yeah. Like it's...
Yeah, you want to make something that has its own organic life.
Yeah.
Right? It's sort of connected to you in the same way a child is, right? But therefore also increasingly apart from you too.
Yeah, and has it like a real structure that you didn't just invent, but you found that's part of the structure of other things in the world.
Right.
I remember on that note, very tangentially reading Salman Rushdie, and I read the words Christopher Reeve at the beginning of the Satanic Verses, and I thought, oh my God, this in 10 years they will not know. I had the same sort of idea that you can't. It needs to be sort of monolithic, classical. You know, one of the things about a class, there's a great critic, John Simon. He distinguishes romantic from classical, and classical is sort of stony hard. It's non-organic in a certain way. It's built for durability, and the romantic is absolutely taken with the trends of the moment and malleable, et cetera, et cetera. But I think it's fair to say you're not so doctrinaire as that anymore.
I've never heard of that distinction put that way. I don't know.
I also think something has changed because of the internet. Like if my son read that Satanic Verses and didn't know who Christopher Reeve was, it would take him 10 seconds to look it up on the internet.
But then he's on the internet, and then the book's down.
Then the book's there, yeah. And
on the internet for that
maybe,
hour.
yeah, it never comes back. I don't know. But there is something about, and I'm sure you feel this way too, there's sometimes you read something and you're like, I don't remember what that is or whatever, and you can look it up. And so I feel like we have a slightly different relationship to allusion in that way, sort of allusion broadly speaking, like pop culture references or classical references, literary references, because if it's made explicitly, we can trust others to find it. You know, like I've got a poem about August 11th. There are a bunch of police shootings on August 11th. If you want to look up August 11th police shooting, you can look it up and see some of these descriptions that are sort of outside the poem. But I sort of know that you can do that if you really care to.
So do you write poetry differently now because of the internet than you did? I mean, there's always the internet, but not in the same way.
Right.
20 years ago, whatever, 25 years ago? Because people can look stuff up? Like, are you more likely to put in an obscure reference?
It's a good question. I don't know the answer. There's a story about Yeats, I think, who names his maid in a poem because he knew by then he was so famous that he knew that people would find out that Clara or whatever her name was his maid, and so he could do that 100 years ago, but that was Yeats. So I don't know. I don't know the answer. I don't know the answer to the question. It's a great question, though. Sorry, I'm going to stop doing that. Like, that's way too many. Okay.
By no means. By no means. By no means.
How many callbacks are allowed?
So we have one last question here. Pressure. But I think it's kind of it's a very personal question, which is in pure color, the word, criticism, and I'd say the word crisis, the root word, are everywhere in the book. But I had a very hard time figuring out or getting my mind around the valorization of the critic, especially from the artist's point of view. On the one hand, I was reading something completely different, which talking about narratives, and the idea of a narrative is to criticize life. Like, that's its job. And so criticism is like a productive faculty. It's helpful, and it's part of any work of art. And certainly, again, it's part of the Book of Poems when I put it that way as well. And crisis is what is occurring personally and publicly. But so my question goes back to you, like, is it correct to say that there's a valorization of critics? On the one hand, Mira drops out of criticism school, Annie becomes a fixer, and Maddie just seems like a blowhard, a little. And so how do the two fit together in your world, or in the world of this novel, I'd say?
Well, I mean, the critic in the book, the premise of the book is that God created the world. God's a painter and created the world and put humans in the world in order to act as his critics. And he listens to all the criticisms, and then the world's this first draft is gonna be scrapped, and then there's gonna be a second draft that takes into account all the criticisms, and it's gonna be a world that has gained a lot but lost a lot, because it's wonderful to be in kind of like a broken, fallen time in its own way, because we're all together experiencing it together. So the critic is not necessarily something that I'm valorizing. It's more, I'm trying to understand how it can be that we live in this magnificent universe and have this gift of consciousness and life, and yet all we do is criticize and critique and complain. And so it was like a way to try to understand, like, well, you know, maybe there's value in our critiques and our complaints and our criticisms, because you can't really square like the majesty of being alive and of the universe with how petty we are in our thoughts day to day. And so it was a way of trying to understand those two things. How do they fit together? And that was sort of the answer that I came up with. And you know, she doesn't want to be a critic. I mean, she hates it. She drops out of criticism school. She wants to be post-critic, but she can't be because she's a human in this
To me, that aspect of the novel is like the most Jewish part of your novel. It's like, oh, of course, like when you given, here's paradise, well, you know, and like there's a little like, and that's not sacrilegious. On the contrary, it's like, I'm talking to God here. You should be able to fix stuff, you know, or you can, like, this can be better, even better, you know, and that's sort of our job. And I think, to me, it felt like that was like, you know, that felt very Jewish to me, that section.
Guys, you are the best. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eric, Sheila, and Adam. Fantastic. And I'll introduce to you now Helen Burstein, who is the chair of the board of the Koffler Center, and my colleague.
Well, thank you. First of all, thank you all for being here, and thank you to our moderators and panelists from both panels, two very different panels, equally fascinating, interesting, and engaging discussion for all of you. So I want to thank you all for being here. It is a partnership between the Koffler Center of the Arts and the Holy Blossom Temple. And it's been a wonderful literary partnership, an opportunity to get to know authors and to get to know their work and their appreciation of what it is that they do, their craft, and how we read them much, much better. So I always choose, if I get the opportunity, to do thank yous, because who doesn't love doing thank yous? And there are so many of them to go around in this case. So a big thank you to the Koffler Center's partners in this Holy Blossom, where we are right now, but also the people involved in the committee that did all the organizing of this. And first and foremost among them, Cynthia Good, who is a phenomenon. Cynthia has a storied career in working with books, good books. and she knows good books very well. And Cynthia is also a longtime member of the Koffler Center of the Arts Board of Directors, has just recently completed her term of many years, and we're very grateful to her for her service there, as well as the work that she brings to this group and many, many others all the time. I also want to acknowledge and thank again the people who have been supportive of, and in fact are the main reason that the Vine Awards exists, and that's the Vine family, Lily Glowinski and, Norm Glowinski and Lily Vine. I want to thank them and acknowledge them again. And, you may have noticed Ben McNally sitting back here very patiently and quietly. He does more than sells books. He appreciates them and brings them to people in many, many forms and many ways. So if you like what you've heard today, make a stop here and buy a book and do more than that. You talk to Ben and give yourself a real treat. I did say before that I found this a fascinating discussion because I really did, and I thought all the moderators and the panelists did offered so much. And I have some notable takeaways that I just, came to me. That's why I was busy taking notes, because there's some things I didn't want to forget. So many insights, like how to appreciate a novel as you do a painting, making art, a book that eats its own tail. I don't quite get that yet, Sheila, but neither do you, so that's very interesting. Also, trust that the absurd thing will work. I agree with that, Adam. And yes, I think you can use Pshaw. I really, I think if it's used well. And being deliberately mushy is a very good thing, or it could be. In our first panel, I just love the discussion about a horse named Theodore that always moves toward Israel. There's just, something very special about that. How to remain human during life-threatening conditions. That's a deeper question. And how to survive and do so in a meaningful way. And finally, one of the things I take away is having had many kids who've gone through this, all teenagers are probably pirates. Thank you so much for being here.